Hello, class. Welcome back. Today we're looking at Baruch Spinoza, and while we're looking at Baruch Spinoza, we also want to take into consideration the way in which we're understanding metaphysics in general. Okay, so metaphysics is a topic in philosophy whereby when we are metaphysical or when we are engaged in an understanding of metaphysics, we're thinking of the way in which parts relate to the whole, and then likewise we're understanding the way in which we're picturing reality in general. So there's other ways in which we understand metaphysics, but those are just a couple, and those two ways are important for our understanding of Baruch Spinoza. So once again, whenever we're engaged in asking ourselves, what is reality in general, we're asking a metaphysical question. And then likewise, if we're concerned with how it is that we're understanding relations of parts to a whole, or a part to the whole picture, or a part to a whole understanding, etc., we are also engaged in a metaphysical understanding as well. So metaphysics is a broad topic in philosophy, and in this way, we're also looking at a way in which parts are related to the whole. Okay, and so Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 and dies in 1677. And so he was of Portuguese and Jewish descent. He was born in Amsterdam, and because his family was seeking refuge in Holland due to religious persecution in Portugal. Okay, so during the 17th century, Spinoza is known as one of the great rationalists as well. And along with his contemporary philosopher, the French-Dutch rationalist René Descartes, who was born in 1596 and dies in 1650. So he was a contemporary of Descartes. And when we name Spinoza as a rationalist, what do we actually mean? So when we're thinking of Spinoza as a rationalist, what is it that we're pointing out? So first, we need to see that rationalism is epistemological. In other words, epistemology has to do with the way in which we're understanding reason and knowledge in general, okay? And so that also is a crossover with metaphysics. So not only are we looking at a metaphysical understanding, we're also looking at an epistemological understanding as well, and also in Spinoza's context, an ethical understanding, okay? So yes, a fundamental way in which we understand the framework of knowledge, and the ways we know about the world are, in Spinoza's context, inherently rational, okay? So for the rationalist, our knowledge is sourced in our capacity to reason. So reason then is a basis for the way in which we know about things. So this is primarily distinguished from empiricism, or an empirical way in which we know things, okay, in terms of impressions and perceptions. So are there philosophers that we studied that are empiricists? Yes, the utilitarians were empiricists, and then also David Hume, okay, were empiricists. And Spinoza's most famous work is simply titled The Ethics. So we could also see that this is a crossover with ethical thinking, moral thinking as well. And so his work, The Ethics, is radical due to Spinoza's view on God. And so also due to the way in which the book was written out as a mathematical proof as well, demonstrated in geometrical order, of which of course makes for difficult reading. Likewise, his inclusion of long axioms and propositions in the ways that we are taking things to be true that serve as a conclusion of his reasoning. So, in other words, in order to justify the way in which we're understanding things reasonably, Spinoza thought that it was important to lay out his reasoning in terms of axioms and proofs in order to justify this rationally, right? So, to be sure, Spinoza's philosophy in the Ethics is deeply metaphysical as much as it is rational, and also extending to, obviously, what is ethical, which Spinoza's emphasis on the ethical notion is that instead of leading a life dominated by indulging the passions and pursuing the acquisition of ephemeral materialism, our ethical goal should always be in the pursuit of rational knowledge, okay? And in other words, what we might consider a pursuit of the philosophy in the sciences and mathematics. So in other words, virtue for Spinoza had to do with self-control, but also the way in which we are studying such things as philosophy and mathematics. So in other words, for Spinoza, to study mathematics and philosophy is also hand in hand with the way in which we are ethical, okay? So in other words, that's part of the reason why he's naming it the Ethics, okay? So we see such activities as secular, in other words, the study of philosophy and mathematics. Yet with Spinoza's guidance, we're not only getting closer to God, we are, of which we'll look at in a minute. Underlying this drive is the pursuit of a life of reason in terms of conatus. Conatus is a Latin word spelled C-O-N-A-T-U-S, conatus. And conatus is a way in which Spinoza was contending with the principle of inertia, as with Sir Isaac Newton's law of motion. And roughly, an object continues its current motion until any force causes its speed or direction to change, okay? And this is also likened to Aristotle's telos, whereby conatus then, for Spinoza, apart from Newton's idea of inertia and Aristotle's idea of telos, is how it is for Spinoza, how it is that we characterize the life force, okay, or force of will. And for Spinoza, as he writes in the Ethics, each thing as far as it lies in itself strives to preserve its being. So for you and me, it's a way in which we're thinking of the preservation of the life force and the drive in terms of life force as well, conatus. So yet given this framework, we also need to recognize that Spinoza did not think we had free will. In fact, he was deterministic. In other words, we are simply held with the basic notion that given the interconnectivity of everything, our lives are caught up in a web of causes that we're usually not aware of, to the degree that we usually are free to do as we please in the world is what we think. Yet due to this chain of causations, according to Spinoza, we are ultimately acting by way of reacting to all the causes in our lives, which Spinoza sources as deterministic. So that's what deterministic means, is in a way in which we're abiding by the laws of nature. And so free will is not really an open question for Spinoza. Yet Spinoza was, in an ancient sense, also eudaimonic, okay? In that to be virtuous is a way in which we're exhibiting self-control, and as we pointed out, coupled with the way in which we're enlightening ourselves by way of mathematics and philosophy and study of religion as well, to be closer to God. So to understand the larger whole of perfection, that is representative of our inextricable relation to the larger whole of God and the universe. Okay, so this position by which we're thinking of our part in the universe in relation to the larger whole, which is God, is taking center stage as far as how it is that we're thinking of Spinoza's explanation of God as in terms of metaphysics. So what we need to understand is that for Spinoza, God is not a person that stands outside of nature, okay? God is central and indistinguishable from what we call nature, universe, laws, reason, truth, conatus, etc., etc. And this is another way of describing what is termed in philosophy immanence. I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E, immanence. In other words, God is not transcendent or a person. The divine encompasses the whole of the material world. So in other words, everything is God. God is not a person in this regard. So when you're writing about God by way of Spinoza, you cannot write about him in this context, or you cannot write, you cannot write about God as, or think about God as a person, because God is essentially everything, okay, in the universe. God is central. And so this is another way of characterizing God as monistic, or in other words, everything is one. In other words, everything is God, okay? And it's not to be thought of as everything is the person known as God. It's that everything just simply is God, okay? Gender neutral, okay? And so Spinoza's metaphysical outlook is what we refer to as substance monism, okay? Versus a mind-body dualism, as with his contemporary Descartes, who wrote about what we call mind-body dualism. In other words, there's a separation between our mind and our body, whereas with Spinoza, everything, including us, all of us, are God. Everything that we look to, every bit of everything is God. So that is a monistic worldview. And so that fits into, again, our perspective, our metaphysical perspective, by saying that everything is what is considered the whole. Everything plays a part in the whole by virtue of it being God, by virtue of every single part of the universe is God for Spinoza, okay? And so what we need to look at then is a diagram that I'm including in our on our announcements, and I'm just going to show it to you here. You don't need to see everything here because you probably won't be able to see everything, but it's the diagram that I've posted online. It's probably showing up as backwards, but that's fine. So what you need to see is that you have three ways in which we're understanding the world, and likewise God, okay? So in other words, the first way in which we understand God is as a substance, and namely, God is all substance. For Spinoza, there is only one substance, okay? It's only one substance, and it is otherwise known as God. Everything is material and immaterial, and all of what's immaterial and material consists of the one substance that is God for Spinoza, okay? And then we have what he refers to as attributes, okay? So that's the next breakdown of the whole into parts, okay? So then we have attributes. So one attribute of God is known by thinking. In other words, we think about things. And thinking about things is an attribute. So for Spinoza, there are an infinite number of attributes of the one substance of God, okay? Yet we are only aware of two attributes, thinking and extension. Thinking and extension. These are also understood as mind and matter, okay? And so as we looked at, one attribute of God is known by thinking. In other words, to think is to understand one attribute of the substance otherwise known as God, okay? And then another attribute of God is known as extension, okay? This is a way in which we're understanding matter. So all the matter of the world is an extension of the one substance known as God, okay? So the one substance known as God is also understood in terms of a material manifestation of God, okay? Then we have modes, and that's over here. So then we have modes. So in other words, modes are, for Spinoza, the representational details of thinking and extension, which also correspond to mind and matter, as we just pointed out. And so with our thinking, we have beliefs and desires. And with extension, we know about shape and size. So that's where we're getting to the base details of how it is that we're understanding matter by way of material and likewise by thinking. And it's also the way in which we're getting in touch with God. So again, to get closer to God is not necessarily going to church, but studying and understanding mathematics and philosophy and also the natural sciences. Because, for example, when we're studying the natural sciences and mathematics and philosophy, we're looking at the way in which we're reasoning about material. In other words, we're thinking about material in a reasonable way by which to get a better picture of how it is that we're understanding parts of God, okay? And what that shows us is that ultimately, of course, there's only one substance known as God, but that's also a way in which we're doing science and also a way in which we're understanding things in a secular way as well. So in other words, there's this strong secular component to the way in which we're understanding Spinoza's God, because Spinoza's God's not someone that we pray to, see, in an ordinary sense, like as with a Christian sense, so on and so forth. So that's one of the reasons why he was looked at as problematic in terms of his understanding of God while he was alive, and why he then had to take refuge in Amsterdam, because Amsterdam at that time was a city that was tolerant of radical views, so on and so forth, and so Spinoza made that his home. All right, so thank you, and I think we'll stop the video lecture from here, and we'll talk more about the topic later. So thank you, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.